In this example, I want to go ahead and take a look at AWS CodeBuild. And the example that I want to use is taking some raw Java source code, uploading it to an S3 bucket, and then having AWS CodeBuild build that Java source code into a compiled jar file, so a compiled Java file. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I want to create a project on my desktop. So right now I have my text editor open. I have my desktop as a project folder. So I'm going to create a new folder inside my desktop called Cloud for Developers CodeBuild. And in here, I need a specific directory structure for my Java source code. So I'm going to create a new folder called src. And then in src, I'm going to have a new folder called main. And then inside of main, I'm going to have a new folder called Java. Okay, so there's my three directories for source. And then inside of source, I also want to have a new folder for testing. So here's a new folder called test, and then Java there as well. So I'm going to have a new folder called Java, and that's kind of the setup. So my directory structure is set up, and I really don't need my desktop folder here now, but I guess it doesn't hurt. There's nothing really on my desktop. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a Java file that I'm going to use as my demo application. So as my source code, I'm going to have a Java file. And that Java file is going to exist right here in this Java folder. So I'm going to say I want a new file. And it's asking me for a name. So my name for my Java file, this is just Java syntax and Java, the Java world. I'm going to have a class called messageUtil. So my file name needs to be messageutil.java. Okay, so because my file name is messageutil.java, then I'm going to have a public class called messageutil. Okay, so here's my class definition. And my class definition will have one private variable. It's going to be a string, and Java strings are uppercase, called message. So it's my private instance variable. And then I'll have my constructor. So my constructor is going to match my class name. It's going to take one incoming parameter, which is a message. And I'm going to assign the local instance variable to the parameter that was passed in to my constructor. And then I'm going to have two public methods. So I'm going to have a print message and a salutation message. So I'm going to have a public string print message where I use system.out.println, where I output the instance variable, and then I'm going to return that instance variable. And then I'm going to have another public string salutation message where I'm going to say that the message is equal to hi plus the instance variable message. I'm going to say system.out.println my message, and then I'm going to return the message. Okay, so this is my class definition. So just a simple Java class definition. And what I want to do is I eventually want to compile this into a jar file. But before I do, I want to make sure that it passes a few tests. So I'm going to use JUnit to test this. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want a new file here. And the file name that I'm going to want is test messageutil.java. I have to import JUnit. So just a few JUnit imports. I'm going to have my public class, and my class name has to match my file name, so test message util. I'm going to have a string message equal to Brian. And then I'm going to create an instance of my message util class. So message util, message util equal to a new message util. So I'm creating a variable named message util lowercase based on the class called message util uppercase. So that's the class that I created over here. So I'm saying create a new instance of that, and I'm calling this constructor. And when I call the constructor, it's going to require that I pass in a message. So my message is going to be Brian. Okay, so that's my message when I pass it in. And then I'm going to use a directive, a test directive. So here's one of my tests. So I'm going to have a public void test print message. And then I'm going to have one other test because I want complete code coverage. So public void test salutation message. Okay, and the way I'm going to handle test print message is I'm going to say system.out.println inside test print message. And then I actually want to test. I want to use assert equals message, and then I'm going to use my message util object that I created up above. And I'm going to get the result of that print message, which is going to return a string, hopefully matching the message. So I passed in Brian, I should get back Brian. So if you remember our print message, the return value of our print message was our internal variable that got set during the constructor phase of things. Okay, so we're just asserting that those things are equal. Okay, and then our next test will be system.out.println inside test salutation message. And then I'm going to assert equals again. And my assert equals is going to be hi. And then because I concatenated things, so I'm going to have that hi plus Brian in my output. So that's what I'm asserting. So if I go back over to my output, I had this hi plus this exclamation point plus the message. So what I'm asserting is I'm saying, let me actually create a variable for it, message equals hi plus Brian. And then I'm going to use my assert equals to say that my message is equal to my message util dot salutation message. And I'm going to get the result from that. Okay, so those are my source code files that I'm going to use. And at that point, I should be okay there. What I now have to do is I have to use Maven to actually run these tests and define my phases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a POM XML file. Okay, and that POM XML file needs to be at the root of my Cloud for Developers CodeBuild folder. So I'm going to go ahead and create that new file. It's going to be pom.xml. And basically, this is a file that's going to include Apache Maven instructions in order to build this message util 1.0-jar. So it's just a simple message utility application. I went ahead and copied this from an old version and modified it, so I just copied and pasted it here so that we didn't have to go through creating that XML file. So here's that XML file that has those build instructions to build our Java application. So you'll notice a couple of things. It's going to build our application into a jar file, and then it's going to run our JUnit tests. and verify that all of that's working. So this is all in Maven. Okay. Now that I've done that, I have to have a build spec file. Okay, so that build spec file is going to be a new file called appspec.yaml. And I'm going to version it. And then I have to set up the phases. So the first phase that I'm going to have is the install phase. And during the install phase, I need to have specific runtime versions. And the runtime versions that I need is Java and Corretto 11. And then my pre-build phase, I'm going to just echo you in the pre-build phase. Okay, so I'm just echoing that out. And then the build, the commands that I'm going to use, I'm going to have another echo. So build started on the specific date. And then I'm going to use the Maven install command. And then the post build. We're going to have some commands. And again, I'm going to echo build completed on date. And then my artifacts from all of this will be target message util -1.0.jar. Okay, and I know that I'm getting the 1.0 from this XML file. I didn't necessarily cover that we're versioning this as version 1.0. Okay, so that's all packaged up. And I noticed that I have this in the wrong spot. So you'll see that that app spec file is actually in the source code. I don't want it there, so I'm going to move it to the Cloud for Developers. And now you'll see it's there. And the other thing I screwed up is because this is CodeBuild as opposed to CodeDeploy, it should be my build spec, not app spec. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to be build spec. Okay, so now it's in the right location with the right name. Okay. Okay, so we have our source code set up. This is our application that we want to be working with. What I want to do is, let's go ahead and close this down for a second. We can always come back to it, but let's close it down for a second. I'm going to go ahead and minimize Chrome, and then those files are sitting on my desktop. What I want to do is I want to take all of these files. So notice I'm not taking the container folder. I want to take all of those files and I want to compress them. And it doesn't matter what this zip file is until we get over to AWS and the code build process. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this message util, just to kind of match what we were using for our application. So it's message util.zip. And now what I want to do is I want to go through a build process. But before I do that, this message util.zip is my source code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use two S3 buckets for this process. The first is going to be my source code, this zip file. So I'm going to have an S3 bucket that contains this zip file, which is my source code. And then I want a second S3 bucket, which is my output, my compiled source code. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Chrome, and I'm going to go to S3, and I'm going to create two buckets, one for my source code and then one for my output. So I'm going to call this Cloud for Developers source code. And I'm just going to create the bucket. And then I'm going to create a second bucket, which is Cloud for Developers Output. And I'm going to create that bucket. Okay, so the source code is going to have that zip file that we created, which is our original source code. It included all of our Java as well as our Maven XML description file and our build spec. And I'm going to go ahead and send that up to S3. Okay, so that file's in S3. And the idea is that I want CodeBuild, so AWS CodeBuild, to take the code that's in my source code folder, build it, create a compiled object, which is going to be that message util 1.0-jar or -1.0.jar, and I want that to end up in my Cloud for Developers output folder. So this S3 bucket that has nothing in it right now. Okay, so that's the idea. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to CodeBuild, and I want to create a new build project. I have to name it, so I'm going to call this my Cloud for Developers Java build. Okay, my source code provider is not AWS CodeCommit, it's going to be S3, and you'll see some of the other tools that we can use when we're building our codes. We could use GitHub or Bitbucket or CodeCommit, but we're going to use S3 for the time being. We're going to use our source code as our input bucket, our source. And the file, this S3 object or key, is going to be message util.zip. Okay, we're going to use a managed image, and the operating system we're going to use is Amazon Linux 2. The runtime that we're going to use is standard, and then the image that we want is x86 64-bit standard 2.0. And I don't think I have to change anything else. I'm going to use an existing service role. I have used a build spec file. So you can see that it's looking for a build spec.yaml file. Okay, the artifacts are the output. Okay, so the type is S3, and the bucket name is Cloud for Developers Output. We don't have to specify the output file name because that's going to be taken care of for us, and the path is also going to be taken care of for us. We're not going to package the artifacts. And then we're set to go. Okay, so I'm creating the build project with those options configured. And once that's set up, I'm ready to start the build. So you can see it has my primary repository, and then it has my artifacts output. And if I go ahead and start this build, it takes a second. So it says that the default timeout is 1 hour. It does not take 1 hour to build this, but I'm going to go ahead and start this build. So the build was successfully started. I can create notifications for this so that when the build completes, I'll get notified. I'll also get a status description change. So right now, this build is in progress, and it's my expectation that this build will be successful. I don't know that for sure. I might have made a mistake along the way, but my expectation is that it's going to be successful. What I want to do is I want to go through this successful outcome and kind of show you the artifacts that get produced. So I want to show you that compiled source code that gets produced. And then I want to go ahead and make a change so that our code actually fails this build process and what that would look like. Okay, so you'll notice that it did fail. And what we'll see down below is expected pre-build to be of struct type found list instead at line 8 in my YAML file. Okay, so let me go ahead and open up that project. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Atom. Okay, so my pre-build. Expected pre-build to be of struct type build spec.yaml. I'm just clicking to view the entire log. Doesn't give me much additional information. And it looks like I'm just missing the commands. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm going to have to repackage this. So I'm going to go to my desktop. This zip file is no longer good. I want to repackage these things, so I'm going to compress them. I'm going to call it message util again. And then in order for this to work, I have to go out to S3 again. So I'm going to go to S3 to my source code bucket. So my source code bucket has the wrong source code, so let me go ahead and delete that. Okay, and I think I grabbed the wrong name, so I used an uppercase M. I want to be case sensitive about this. And then I'm going to go ahead and upload those changes. So I made the change to my file, to my build spec, so that I added the list of commands. So I was expecting a list. It was the list of commands, and then I had just the command in there. So I think that we've resolved the issue, and we will see. So now that I've made the change, I want to go ahead and try to go to my build project again, and I want to try to build this thing again. Okay, so I'm going to start the build again. And again, it's not instantaneous, but I will get progress indicators about how this build is going. And my expectation, like I said in the first place, was that this build would be successful. And I'm jumping around a little bit there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording while, and it looks like I ran into the same issue again here. So the build failed, and I'm getting that same error, expected artifacts to be of struct type found list instead. So if I go back over to my Atom file, artifact should be a collection of files. So let me go ahead and save that. I'm going to delete the zip file again. So that's gone. I need to compress those files again. So here are the files. I'm going to go ahead and compress them. I'm going to rename it to message util. And hopefully we have it this time. So again, back to S3. I'm deleting the errant message util.zip source code. I'm going to upload my file again with the modifications that we just added. Okay, so there it is with the modifications. And now I want to retry the build again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording while this is in progress. Okay, it looks like I'm worse at this than I thought I was. So what's happening is I have an invalid build spec phase called artifacts. I didn't really want artifacts to be a build spec phase. So one last try here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete message util.zip. And this goes into the importance of indentation. Artifacts is not a build spec phase. it's the result of the output, so it's going to be lined up with the phases. So I'm going to go ahead and save it now. So Maven is very sensitive about your indentation. Now that that's modified, I should be able to go back out to my Finder window, delete the errant build, the errant compressed source code. I'm going to call this message util.zip again. I'm going to upload it to S3. And I'm going to kick off the build one last time. So again, I was not expecting this to be that difficult, but sometimes it's nice for you to see me run into some problems. So again, I'm going to retry the build, and then as that build gets kicked off and is in progress, I'm going to pause the screencast so that you don't have to. Okay, and now finally we have a successful build. Okay, so we have a successful build, and where that's going to show up is not in our Cloud for Developer source code, but if I go over to S3 again, we had two buckets that we initially created. One for our source code, which was where we were uploading our message util.zip, and then a second for the output after the code has been built. So some compiled Java code, and you'll notice that we have Cloud for Developers Java build, our target, and then we have our message util-1.0.jar. That's the compiled output of our original source code. So we're able to use the CodeBuild tools to our for our benefit. Now that I have a successful code build in place, I want to show you how far we can go with this. So we're using Maven to run some JUnit tests. And if we go back to our source code, we set it up so that those tests would pass based on our message utility. So right now I have two tests for our two public methods that are in that message util class. What I want to do is I want to assert that these things are equal, but in fact have a failure. So instead of saying hi, I want to be a little more formal and say hello. And that does not match what's going on with my message util class. So my message util class is saying hi, but my test is now expecting it to say hello. So I have a conflict there. It's going to fail. My assert equals test is going to fail. Okay, so now we've already went through this process a couple of times, but what I want to do is I want to repackage my source code. So I'm going over to my output. So this message util.zip is going to go away. I'm going to rebuild that. So I'm going to compress this into message util.zip again. I want to clear out my S3 buckets. So I want to clear my S3 buckets. So in order for that to happen, I guess it actually is not necessary for me to do that. But what I do want to do is I want to clear out my source code bucket. So I want to clear the existing source code because we just saw that it was successful when we built that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And I'm going to upload that new message util.zip where I have the failed test. Okay, and now if I go to my bucket, so I have my source code and it's going to have my failed test. Now I can retry my build. Okay, it's in progress. And I already know this is going to fail. This is an intentional failure on my part. So what's going to happen is we're going to get into the build rules, and one of that pom.xml file says, hey, I should run those tests. So those Maven tests are going to get run, and what's going to happen is the build is going to fail because the tests fail. So the build only succeeds if the tests succeed. In this case, the tests are going to fail, so the build is also going to fail. And it's a matter of hurry up and wait while we're waiting for this build to fail. And you'll also notice I know the build's going to fail, so I didn't clear out the output that wasn't necessary because I knew that the build was going to fail. So if I scroll down now, what we're going to see is all of the progress that was made. So there's a ton of progress that was made. Eventually, we get down to the fact that our test failed. Okay, and you'll notice what ends up happening. There were 2 tests run. We had 2 tests that were put in place. One was failed. And you'll notice the failed test was that test salutation message. It expected hello, Brian, but it was actually hi, Brian. Okay, so it's telling you what the expected result was and what the actual result was and why that test failed. Okay, and that's exactly the way we coded it. So we intentionally put that failure in place. But what's important here is that the code build process that's in AWS runs our tests and makes sure that our tests are all successful before our code build is actually successful. Okay, so this is just a simple example of a Java class definition getting compiled. So Java source code class definition getting compiled into compiled Java output. So a compiled executable. Okay, and we're just using the CodeBuild AWS tools to do that.